Up until the end of the 18th century, all European Jews, with few exceptions, were culturally the equivalent of the ultra-Orthodox, the Charedim of today. Those few who were not were regarded as heretics by the religious leaders and were often expelled from the Jewish community, as happened with Spinoza. The Jews living in Europe had from the very beginning of their sojourn there held themselves aloof from the Greco-Roman civilization of the people among whom they lived, since they believed that the European Christian peoples were descended from the ancient Romans and had thereby inherited the blood guilt of the Romans for the destruction of the Jerusalem in 70 CE. As a result of that belief, the Jews considered it sinful to study any of the arts and sciences of the European peoples. In the early medieval period, the Jews' rejection of European civilization did not matter, since their own material civilization was superior to that of barbarian Europe, which possessed only a much degraded residue of Greco-Roman civilization. However, as the European peoples progressed intellectually and materially, they drew level in development with the Jews and eventually outclassed them. Because of their rejection of European civilization, the Jews of Europe missed out on all the intellectual and cultural developments of the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and reacted to those developments by withdrawing more and more into their self-imposed isolation in the ghettos. The result was that by the 18th century, the Jews of Europe were culturally well below the level reached by the most advanced European peoples. It was not for nothing that French intellectuals of the Enlightenment such as Voltaire and Montesquieu regarded the Jews of their time as obscurantist fanatics. The main factor that allowed the emergence of an intellectual enlightenment among the Jews of Europe and their assimilation into European civilization was the teachings of the 18th century rabbi, Jacob Emden of Altona. He realized that the Jews of his time had fallen culturally well behind the peoples among whom they lived, because of their stubborn rejection of European intellectual civilization. In order to provide a ritually acceptable reason for abandoning that rejection, he announced his discovery that the European peoples were not descended from the Romans after all, and hence did not bear their hereditary blood guilt, and accordingly it was not sinful to study the European arts and sciences. The Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, which began in the late 18th century, was the result of Rabbi Emden's proclamation. Jews began to study European arts and sciences, which gave rise to the remarkable Jewish intellectual blossoming in the 19th century. In the field of religion, both Reform Judaism and modern Orthodox Judaism were products of that blossoming. Today, only a small minority of Jews are traditionalist in the way that their ancestors were back in the 18th century. However, their numbers appear to be growing due to their high birth rate, which was a typical feature of pre-modern Jewish society and which they have retained. As Pamela B. Zohar writes, orthodoxy, the term, the movement, the set of ideas, arose in response to reform. Outside of that, it's not a designation with much specific meaning. There were certainly more liberal and more conservative interpretations of Jewish law and teaching. A Haaretz article, for example, recently detailed ancient Jewish art showing the figure. This indicates that visual representation of human form was not seen as a violation of the commandment against idolatry, at least in some parts of ancient Israel. Jewish tradition is certainly influenced by Greek words and ideas, and in Hellenic Greece, there were different ideas about how much we could accept and receive from Greek culture, versus focusing more intensively on our own civilization, language, and tradition. Then as now, people had different feelings and sensibilities about assimilation, about the wider world and the rise of new ideas. For example, the Hebrew word for heretic, apikoros, is actually taken from the term Epicurean, the hedonistic philosophy in ancient Greece, although there, naturally, it has a negative meaning. The disputes between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai are famous in all forms of Judaism, and a bedrock part and principle of the body of law and teaching known as the Talmud. Ultimately, most disputes were decided in favor of the school of Hillel. It is recorded in large part because of his moderation, sensibility, and commitment to studying the views of those with whom he disagreed. Before the rise of Jewish emancipation, an extremely partial, incomplete process that began in France, Jews were mostly isolated from broader society. This was the case pretty much everywhere, excepting China and India. Otherwise, in Europe, Arab Islamic lands, and Ethiopia, Jews lived in isolation in large part. They weren't opposed to or accepting of modernity because modernity wasn't really a trend yet. There is a range of ideas in the tradition itself about all kinds of subjects. Also, Judaism is not only a religion but also, and in some ways most essentially, about peoplehood, civilization, community and culture. Jews were busy preserving our own food and language and literary and religious cultures and so much more. Maimonides' 13 Principles of the Faith is a core set of ideas that runs through many interpretations of the Jewish tradition. But it's not a solely orthodox part of Jewish liturgy, spirituality or heritage. Plenty of Jews rely on it as a sort of Jewish statement of principles. That said, Jewish faith and culture and heritage is defined more by deeds than beliefs, at least comparative to other religions.